The story begins with Dr. Watson reading the morning newspaper at breakfast when he notices his wife looking at him curiously. She remarks that he must be thinking about his old friend Sherlock Holmes. Watson is surprised by her observation, and she explains that she could tell from his expression and the way he was reading the agony column, something he only did when reminiscing about his detective adventures. At that very moment, a telegram arrives from Holmes asking Watson to join him on a case in the west of England, specifically in Boscombe Valley. Watson's wife immediately encourages him to go, showing her support for their friendship and his investigative work. Within an hour, Watson is on the train heading toward Boscombe Valley, eager to reunite with his friend and assist in solving another mystery. Meeting Holmes, Holmes meets Watson at the station, and they travel together to their destination. During the journey, Holmes briefs Watson on the case. He explains that he has been retained by the daughter of the accused man, Miss Alice Turner, who desperately believes in her father's innocence despite overwhelming evidence against him. The case details the victim is Charles McCarthy, a widower who lived with his 18-year-old son, James McCarthy, at Hatherley Farm near Boscombe Pool. The McCarthys had lived there for several years, having come from Australia. They were tenants of John Turner, a wealthy landowner who had also made his fortune in Australia and now lived at the nearby Boscombe Valley estate with his daughter Alice. Charles McCarthy was found dead near Boscombe Pool with his head crushed by repeated blows from a blunt weapon. The primary suspect is his own son, James McCarthy, and the evidence against him appears damning. The evidence against James, the circumstances that make James appear guilty, are numerous and compelling. James and his father were seen arguing violently just before the murder. A gamekeeper named William Crowder witnessed them quarrelling as they walked toward Boscombe Pool. The argument appeared heated and intense. Shortly after, James was found by the pool standing over his father's body with blood on his hands and clothes. When he was discovered, he appeared shocked and distressed, but this could be interpreted as either genuine horror at finding his father murdered or guilt at having committed the crime. James's own testimony seems to harm his case rather than help it. He admits to having had a disagreement with his father, but claims that when he heard his father cry out, he ran back to find him dying. However, his account of seeing a strange figure fleeing the scene, which he describes vaguely, seems like a desperate attempt to deflect suspicion. The murder weapon was never found, but inspectors discovered a grey cloak near the scene that belonged to James McCarthy. This places him definitively at the location. Most damning of all, a witness named Patience Moran, the 14-year-old daughter of the lodge keeper, testified that she saw James and Charles McCarthy arguing violently. She stated that Charles raised his hand as if to strike his son, and moments later, James appeared to strike his father. She then saw James raise his hand, and his father fell to the ground. Terrified, she ran to tell her mother what she had witnessed. James's defense, despite all this evidence, James McCarthy maintains his innocence. His story is that he had been in Bristol that morning and returned to find a note from his father asking him to meet at Boscombe Pool at 3 o'clock. He went to the pool and found his father already there. They had a conversation that became somewhat heated. He admits they argued, but refuses to explain what the argument was about, saying it's a private matter that has nothing to do with the murder. He claims he left his father by the pool and went into the woods. A few minutes later, he heard his father cry out, "Cooing," which was their traditional signal to each other. He rushed back to find his father on the ground, fatally wounded. Dying from terrible head injuries, his father's last words, according to James, were broken and unclear. Something about a rat, and mentioning the name of someone from their past in Australia. James insists he saw a figure running away through the trees. A cloaked figure, but he was so focused on his dying father that he didn't pursue this person. When he looked around, the figure had vanished. Why Holmes? takes the case most investigators consider the case closed. The local police believe they have overwhelming evidence against James McCarthy, and the coroner's inquest returned a verdict of willful murder against him. He has been committed for trial at the assizes. However, Alice Turner, James's childhood friend, and someone who clearly has deep feelings for him, refuses to believe he is guilty. She has used her father's influence and resources to engage Sherlock Holmes to investigate the case and find the truth. Holmes tells Watson that while the evidence against James appears strong, there are several points that intrigue him and suggest the young man might indeed be innocent. First, James's refusal to explain what he and his father argued about, even though it might help his case, suggests he is protecting someone or some secret, behavior more consistent with honor than guilt. Second, the dying man's last words about a rat seem cryptic and potentially important. Dying men rarely speak nonsense. There may be a clue in these final utterances. Third, the description of the mysterious cloaked figure, while vague, should not be dismissed entirely. If James were inventing an alibi, he would likely have created a more detailed and convincing description. Holmes is particularly interested in several questions. What was the nature of the relationship between the two McCarthy men? Why had they come from Australia to England? What was Charles McCarthy's connection to John Turner, their landlord, who had also lived in Australia? And most puzzling of all, what could the dying man's reference to a rat possibly mean? The investigation begins as Holmes and Watson arrive in Ross, a market town near Boscombe Valley. Holmes is already formulating theories and planning his investigation. He intends to visit the crime scene at Boscombe Pool, examine all physical evidence, interview witnesses, and most importantly, speak with James McCarthy himself at the prison where he is being held. Holmes reminds Watson that in his experience, the most obvious solution is not always the correct one, and that circumstantial evidence can be very deceptive. He believes that by examining the case with fresh eyes and his analytical methods, he may discover something that the local police have overlooked. Meeting with the police inspector upon arriving in Ross, Holmes and Watson meet with Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, who has been sent from London to handle the case. Lestrade is confident that James McCarthy is guilty and considers the case straightforward. However, he respects Holmes's abilities and agrees to facilitate his investigation, though he clearly believes it will be a waste of time. Lestrade provides Holmes with additional details about the case. He explains that the coroner's inquest was thorough, and every piece of evidence points to James McCarthy. The inspector mentions that even John Turner, the wealthy landowner and father of Alice Turner, testified at the inquest. Though his testimony was brief due to his poor health, Turner suffers from diabetes and is in declining health. Holmes asks several seemingly trivial questions that puzzle Lestrade. He inquires about the exact position of the body, the nature of the injuries, any objects found near the scene, and details about the weather on the day of the murder. Lestrade answers patiently, though he doesn't understand the relevance of these questions. Visiting James McCarthy in prison, Holmes and Watson's first order of business is to visit James McCarthy in the county jail. They find a young man of about 25, handsome but clearly distressed and exhausted from his ordeal. Despite his circumstances, James maintains his composure and dignity. Holmes questions him carefully about the events of that fatal day. James provides more details. He explains that his father had become increasingly insistent over the past few days that James should marry Alice Turner. James admits he has known Alice since childhood and likes her very much, but he cannot marry her because he is already married, a foolish marriage he contracted several years ago with a barmaid in Bristol. This woman, though James tried to support her financially, proved to be of bad character, and they have been separated, though not legally divorced. This revelation explains why James had been in Bristol that morning before the murder. He had gone to see this woman, hoping to convince her to agree to a divorce, or at least a formal separation. The meeting had not gone well. When James returned to Hatherley Farm, he found a note from his father asking him to meet at Boscombe Pool at 3 o'clock. James went there and found his father waiting. His father immediately brought up the subject of marriage to Alice Turner again, and James, still agitated from his difficult meeting in Bristol, finally confessed the truth about his secret marriage. This confession enraged Charles McCarthy. The argument became heated with harsh words exchanged on both sides. James, ashamed and angry, stormed off into the woods to cool down. He was only about 150 yards away when he heard his father's call of "Cooey," their old signal from their days in Australia. James ran back immediately and found his father lying on the ground, bleeding terribly from multiple head wounds. His father was barely conscious but managed to speak a few broken words. James distinctly heard him say something about a rat and what sounded like the name of someone from Ballarat, a place in Australia where they had once lived. James emphasizes that he definitely saw someone running away, a tall man in a grey cloak, but the figure disappeared into the woods, and James was too concerned with his dying father to pursue. Holmes asks about the grey cloak that was found and identified as belonging to James. The young man confirms it is his, but says he must have dropped it earlier when he went to the pool initially. He often wore it when walking around the estate. When Holmes asks what James's relationship with his father was like, James hesitates before admitting it had become strained in recent years. His father had secrets, and sometimes associated with rough characters. Charles McCarthy had money, but James never knew exactly where it came from or why they had left Australia so suddenly years ago. Most importantly, Holmes asks if James can think of anyone who would want to harm his father. James mentions that his father seemed afraid of something or someone, particularly anything connected to their past in Australia, but he knows no specific names or details. Examining the crime scene after the prison visit, Holmes, Watson and Lestrade travelled to Boscombe Pool. The weather has been rainy since the murder, but Holmes insists on examining the scene personally. The pool is a small, reed-girt lake surrounded by woods. The ground is soft and muddy from recent rain. Holmes immediately begins his characteristic detailed examination, moving about with his magnifying glass, studying every inch of ground, every broken twig, every footprint in the mud. Lestrade watches with barely concealed amusement, convinced this is all theatrical nonsense. Watson, however, knows from experience that Holmes's methods, though they may appear strange, are highly effective. Holmes spends considerable time examining the muddy ground around where the body was found. He measures distances, traces footprints, and makes notes. He becomes particularly excited about certain marks in the mud, impressions that seem to interest him greatly. He identifies several sets of footprints: Charles McCarthy's boots, James McCarthy's shoes, the police officer's heavy boots, and what appears to be the gamekeeper's footwear. But then Holmes finds something else, another set of prints, quite distinct from the others. These prints show a man of considerable height, based on the stride length. The left foot prints more deeply than the right, suggesting the person limps slightly. The boots are of an unusual square-toed design. Holmes traces these footprints and determines they approached from the woods, stopped near where Charles McCarthy would have been standing, and then retreated hastily after the murder. Holmes also discovers something in the grass near where the body lay, something the police had missed. He picks up a small, grey, irregularly shaped stone, apparently the murder weapon. It has been washed by rain but still shows traces of blood and hair. More importantly, Holmes notices that it is of an unusual type of stone, not native to this area. He examines the surrounding trees and vegetation, noting broken branches at a certain height, which tells him something about the murderer's stature. He studies the reeds by the pool's edge and finds them trampled in a particular pattern. After about an hour of intensive examination, Holmes announces he has seen enough. He has found the confirmation he needed for his theory. Both Watson and Lestrade are mystified, as Holmes has shared none of his conclusions yet. Visiting John Turner Holmes next insists they must visit John Turner at his estate. Lestrade is surprised by this request, as Turner is quite ill, and his testimony at the inquest revealed nothing particularly useful. However, Holmes is adamant. They arrive at the Turner estate, a grand property reflecting the owner's considerable wealth. They are received by Alice Turner, a beautiful young woman clearly distressed about James McCarthy's imprisonment. She pleads with Holmes to save James, expressing absolute faith in his innocence. It's obvious to all observers that she is deeply in love with him. Alice explains that her father is very ill, and the shock of the murder and subsequent arrest has worsened his condition significantly. However, when she mentions Holmes's visit, Turner insists on seeing the detective. The interview with John Turner receives Holmes and Watson in his study. He is a man of about 60, but illness has aged him considerably. His face is gaunt and yellowed from his diabetes, and he moves with difficulty. Despite his physical weakness, there is still something commanding about his presence, the bearing of a man who has lived an adventurous and perhaps dangerous life. Turner looks at Holmes with penetrating eyes and says, with surprising directness, "I know why you've come. You've figured it out, haven't you?" Holmes responds calmly that he has indeed pieced together the truth, but he wishes to hear it from Turner himself. Turner asks Alice to leave the room, which she does reluctantly. Once they are alone, Turner's composure begins to crack. Turner's confession. John Turner takes a deep breath and begins his extraordinary confession. "Mr. Holmes, I am a dying man. The doctors give me only a few months at most. I had hoped to take my secret to the grave, but I cannot let young James McCarthy hang for a crime I committed. He is innocent, and my conscience, black as it is, will not bear that additional burden." Turner explains that he must go back many years to make Holmes understand the full story. He begins with his time in Australia during the gold rush era of the 1850s and 1860s. The Australian connection, Turner reveals that he was not always the respectable landowner he appears to be now. In his youth in Australia, he was part of a gang of bushrangers, outlaws who robbed gold shipments and travellers. His real name was not John Turner, but Black Jack of Ballarat, a notorious criminal who terrorized the Victoria goldfields. His gang was responsible for numerous robberies and several murders. They were ruthless and feared throughout the region. Turner does not excuse his actions, but explains the desperation and lawlessness of that time and place. One of their most infamous crimes was the robbery of a gold convoy heading from Ballarat to Melbourne. During this robbery, Turner's gang killed 3 guards. Among those guards was a man whose dying words Turner would never forget. The man cursed them and spoke about rats deserting a sinking ship, referring to one of the gang members who had tried to run away during the attack. Charles McCarthy was a member of Turner's gang. He participated in many of their crimes, including that fatal gold robbery. However, McCarthy was always the weakest link, cowardly and prone to drinking. After several narrow escapes from the law, Turner decided to disband the gang and flee Australia. The blackmail Turner managed to escape Australia with his ill-gotten wealth. He came to England, changed his identity, invested his money wisely, purchased the Boscombe Valley estate, married, and had a daughter. He transformed himself into a respectable country gentleman, giving generously to charity and living quietly. Trying to atone for his violent past, for many years he lived in peace, believing his old life was buried forever. His wife died, leaving him to raise Alice alone, and he devoted himself to being a good father and a respectable member of society. Then, about 4 years ago, disaster struck. Charles McCarthy, who had also left Australia and been living in England under his real name, discovered where Turner was living. McCarthy had fallen on hard times and saw an opportunity for easy money. McCarthy came to Boscombe Valley and immediately began blackmailing Turner. He threatened to expose Turner's criminal past unless Turner provided him with money and housing. Faced with the ruin of his reputation and the devastating impact such a revelation would have on his beloved daughter Alice, Turner had no choice but to comply. Turner gave McCarthy the tenancy of Hatherley Farm, rent-free, and provided him with a regular allowance. For years, Turner endured this arrangement, paying for his past crimes through this humiliating blackmail. The final straw, the situation became unbearable when McCarthy made a new demand. He insisted that his son James must marry Turner's daughter Alice. McCarthy saw this as his ultimate triumph, forcing his former gang leader to accept him as family and ensuring his son would inherit part of Turner's wealth. Turner was horrified. He loved his daughter dearly and knew that James McCarthy, though a decent young man, would bring nothing but trouble to Alice. Moreover, the thought of being permanently bound to his blackmailer through family ties was intolerable. McCarthy became increasingly insistent and threatening about this marriage scheme. He sent Turner a note demanding a meeting at Boscombe Pool to discuss the matter one final time. Turner knew what this meant. McCarthy would either get his way, or he would expose Turner's past. The murder on that fateful afternoon, Turner went to Boscombe Pool armed with his hunting weapon, a stone he had brought back from Australia years ago as a memento. He wore a grey cloak and hat to disguise himself. He arrived early and hid in the woods near the pool. He saw Charles McCarthy arrive and wait. Then he saw James McCarthy arrive and watched as father and son argued heatedly. Turner couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw the argument end with James storming off into the woods. McCarthy stood alone by the pool, and Turner saw his opportunity. He emerged from the woods and confronted his old gang member. McCarthy turned, recognized Turner, and his face showed fear. Turner told him the blackmail was over, one way or another. McCarthy tried to threaten him again, mentioning exposure and scandal. Something snapped in Turner. All the years of humiliation, fear, and anger erupted. He struck McCarthy with the stone, once, twice, 3 times. McCarthy fell, mortally wounded. As Turner stood over the dying man, McCarthy looked up at him and whispered, "Blackjack." The Rat, recognizing his old gang leader and perhaps remembering that long-ago robbery at Ballarat where someone had been called a rat. Turner heard James calling "Cooey" and realized the son was returning. He fled into the woods, his old injury from a bullet wound sustained in Australia causing him to limp as he ran. He managed to escape unseen, making his way back through the forest to his estate. After the murder, Turner explains that he has been tormented by guilt ever since, not for killing McCarthy, whom he considers deserved his fate, but for the fact that young James McCarthy has been accused of the crime. James is innocent and was only guilty of bad timing in returning to find his father dying. Turner had hoped the police would be unable to find enough evidence to convict James, but when the case went against the young man, Turner knew he would have to confess. However, his confession would not only send him to prison, where he would die anyway due to his illness, but would also destroy Alice's life by revealing her father's criminal past. He had been in agony over this moral dilemma when he learned that Sherlock Holmes had been engaged to investigate. Turner had heard of Holmes's discretion and wisdom, and he prayed the detective would find a solution. Holmes's solution. After hearing Turner's full confession, Holmes sits in thoughtful silence for a moment. Then he speaks. "Mr. Turner, I understand your situation completely. Here is what I propose. You will write out a full confession of the crime, which I will keep sealed. I will use the evidence I've gathered to convince the authorities that James McCarthy is innocent without revealing your identity as the true killer. I will suggest that an unknown figure from Charles McCarthy's past in Australia, some enemy from his former life, followed him to England and took revenge. This is, after all, essentially the truth. If James McCarthy is convicted despite my efforts, I will present your confession to prevent a miscarriage of justice. However, if my testimony helps acquit him, your confession will remain sealed. You are a dying man, and your daughter has already suffered enough. There is no benefit to society in exposing you now." Turner, tears streaming down his face, grasps Holmes's hand in gratitude. He writes out the full confession, signs it, and gives it to Holmes. He thanks the detective for his mercy and wisdom. The resolution Holmes returns to London and presents his findings to the authorities. He provides detailed evidence of the unknown assailant, the distinctive square-toed footprints, the unusual stone that was clearly not from England, the height and limp of the mysterious figure, and James McCarthy's consistent testimony. About seeing a cloaked stranger, Holmes argues brilliantly that Charles McCarthy clearly had a dark past in Australia, and that someone from that past had caught up with him. James McCarthy's presence at the scene was purely coincidental, and his behavior was entirely consistent with that of an innocent son discovering his dying father. The prosecution's case begins to crumble under Holmes's systematic dismantling of their assumptions. The evidence that seemed so damning now appears merely circumstantial. Most importantly, Holmes demonstrates that James had no credible motive. He had already told his father about his secret marriage, so killing him afterward made no sense. At the assizes, the criminal trial, James McCarthy is acquitted. The verdict is that Charles McCarthy was murdered by person or persons unknown. The case officially remains unsolved, though Holmes knows the truth. Epilogue. 7 months after the trial, John Turner dies peacefully at his estate, with his daughter Alice by his side. His secret dies with him, and he is remembered in the community as a generous and respectable gentleman. James McCarthy, now a free man, is eventually able to obtain a divorce from his unfortunate first marriage. Alice Turner, who stood by him throughout his ordeal, accepts his proposal of marriage.